Would someone take them for a prank? Would they just disappear? Would, someone do something malicious? I was surprised, I was surprisingly worried about a couple of signs. And I kept thinking, why am I worried? Either put them in the garage but just stop worrying. But I found myself waking up each morning, and it's Brisbane, right? So when are you waking up? 5 a.m., bring in daylight saving, just my little plug there. And finding my mind caught up on worrying about things. There are lots of things to worry us. But what is the thing behind those worries that make us worry? We worry about particular things. If the boards got stolen, it would cost some money to replace them. But so what? So there's all these little things that go on, but have you noticed how they kind of grow and they kind of fill your horizon? So actually, if you dig around for a while, the question is asking, why am I worried about this worry? And I want to put it to you that actually the source of all our worries actually is we're not confident that God cares for us. We're not confident that God's got this. Let me bring it back to the A-board signs. It means that, sure, if the signs were stolen, that would be a great thing, but I guess I'm worried about the cost and hassle and energy of replacing them, which means I'm worried about where will that money come from? Where will the time come from? Which actually means then I'm really worried about my life and my steps and what I need to do, and rather than having this confidence, this quiet confidence that God's got this, that God cares for me, that God's in control of the situation, that God will give me the time and energy or protect the boards from being stolen. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't, mean we shouldn't be, kind of laissez-faire and never do any locks up or, leave our keys to our car in our car. That would just be unwise. But actually, because of our worries behind our worries, those little things fill our horizon. And I think what lies behind that, whether we're Christian or not, is this idea that if there is a God, if you're not a Christian, does God really care for us? If you've got Mark chapter 4 open, look at verse 38. I think this verse kind of captures the issue. Jesus was in the stern, the front of the boat, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Don't you think that kind of presents the problem? God, are you awake? Can you see what's going on in my life? Do you care? Or are you, as we say, asleep at the wheel? Are you not really driving the world? Do you not really care what's going on for me and for others? Literally, they say, "Don't you care if we perish?" Don't you care if we perish? That's a deep question, isn't it? Does God care for us? Does God care about the world? Does God care about you as an individual? Does God care about me? Well, we're going to look at the answer to that. And we'll see Jesus' great power. We'll see that God really does care for us, that Jesus cares for the perishing. Look at, picking up at verse 35. That day, when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." If you remember, Mark chapter 4, crowds had been coming from the south of the nation of Israel and from the north and from the west, huge crowds turning up. And Jesus got into a boat and he's taught the parable of the seeds, which is a kind of parable warning people about how well they're listening. Then there's a little kind of interlude where a few more parables are shared with us, but we don't know if they were shared at the time by Jesus or later. But we pick back up in the story where Jesus is in the boat on the Sea of Galilee. "Let us go over the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was, in the boat. There were other boats with them. And what you see in this midst of this kind of tranquil ocean cruise, or Sea of Galilee cruise, is that suddenly death strikes. The fear, the threat of death comes. Verse 37, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. The Sea of Galilee, why would you get kind of such a huge storm? Well, the terrain. The Sea of Galilee is about 700 feet below sea level, and the mountains to the north, Mount Hermon, is 9,200 feet above sea level. That's a massive difference of nearly 10,000 feet. And so that kind of variance between the atmosphere coming off the mountain and coming off the heated plains around the Sea of Galilee leads to huge storms, apparently. That's how it works. Now, look, just another little historic thing. People used to look at this and say, 2,000 years ago, they wouldn't have had a boat. Oh, wait a second, are you saying Jesus plus his 12 disciples fitted in a boat? One boat, and there were other boats with them. People used to look at that and say, no, it's not true. Again, we can see that the Bible is made up of myths. They didn't have boats that big back then on the Sea of Galilee. Well, surprise, surprise, in 1986, a sandstorm uncovered a boat on the edge of the Sea of Galilee that was 26 feet long, so about 8 or 9 metres long, 2.5 to 3 metres wide, 7 metres wide, 26 feet long, 7.5 feet, I've written it down in Imperial, 7.5 feet wide, you'll have to translate, and 4.5 feet high. Basically, perfect for about 12, 13, 14 people, or a crew of 4 or 5 people who were fishing and trying to catch a large number of fish. So this is kind of this is history we're talking about here. Now have a look at the language there in verse 37. The waves are doing what? Nearly swamping the boat. If you've ever been boating, you know that if there's just a few wind and waves, there's a few things you can do. Turn the prow, the front of the boat, into the waves, so you kind of cut through the waves. But these guys, about a third of the crew were fishermen, and there's nothing they can do. That's how serious the storm is. See the language there? It says the waves broke over the boat. I don't know if you have a favourite beach to go swimming at. When I lived in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, Bondi was too crowded. Clovelly, too hard to get parking. So occasionally we'd go to this beach called Maroubra. But how did the waves break there? It was not that gentle kind of cascading wave. They came into the shore and they just flipped up and they smashed down onto the beach. If you didn't know what you were doing, you got slammed in the sand. It was come to Maroubra and get slammed in the sand, probably 50% of the time. That's what's happening here. Huge waves are rising up and smashing down on the boat. Verse 38, Jesus is asleep on a cushion, potentially a wet cushion, but he's just sleeping on the cushion. And it's this picture of complete and total trust in God. Throughout the Old Testament, this trust in God often is related to, I go to sleep at night and I rest and I am unafraid no matter what is going on. There's this little picture. But look at the disciples. Basically they say, how can Jesus be sleeping? We're all gonna die. Verse 38, the disciples woke Jesus and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Don't you care if we drown? You can see the situation. Waves are pounding down on this boat and, fishermen are worried. That means it's a serious storm and Jesus is asleep. He couldn't even be bothered to wake up properly. I don't know if as a father or a mother you've ever ignored your children because you've been in the middle of something important. And the kids, sometimes they say, don't you care? Don't you notice? They want your attention, but there's something that matters to them, and whether they're worried or frightened or want to share with you, But the thing is, they kind of, if you ignore them for a while, it's like, don't you care about me? But what we see is that Jesus is the stiller of storms. Me and this mic are not having fun together. When Ethan sets it up, it's perfect. I must just not be strong enough. I've got to really crank it. What we see is Jesus is the stiller of storms. Verse 39, he got up, rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And the wind and the waves died down and it was completely calm. Picture that. Brisbane has some pretty wild storms, doesn't it? Usually in November and October. And you know they're coming, don't you? If you drive around the streets of Salisbury, what do you see? Well, you see blankets on the top of people's cars. And you see people who don't have a carport snuggling their car into other people's carports. Suddenly people you'd never talked to before have become your friend, and you're wanting to get your car in next to there. And you get the clouds, they get that kind of dark, kind of green, slightly ominous tinge. And you know it's one of those storms. Hail is coming, the wind is going to whip. Can you imagine if it's starting to storm like that and you walked around the streets of your suburb and said to everyone, "Look, don't worry about it. Don't cover up your cars. You don't need to repark them. I've got this. I've got this." Because you're going to stand in the middle of the street when the storm comes and say to the storm, "Shh, down boy, down." Any of you thinking about that, looking forward to the next storm? Or when the next cyclone comes down the north coast of Queensland? Anyone got plans to do that? Absolutely not, right? Who controls the wind and the waves? Who gets to tell lightning what to do? Who tells hail where to go? None of us. But that's what Jesus does. He stands up in the boat and says to the storm, "Shh, sit." And it goes still. There's two things I want to explore with you. Two really applications coming out of this. Jesus shows his power. He stands up in the middle of a storm, and you know what? He does what only God can do. Psalm 107 talks about the Lord Creator that Harry read out for us. And it ends, that little section ends with, he stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. It's the Lord God who stills storms. It's the Creator of everything who controls creation. So who's standing up in the boat who stills the storm? Well, Jesus, who has the very power and authority of God himself. And the conclusion that the church eventually came to is that Jesus is in fact God, God the Son. He has the power and authority of the Creator, but he doesn't wield it asking for God to be at work. He just wields it as if it's his power. Jesus has the power and authority of God. And the disciples get this. Glance down at verse 41. They were frightened of death. But look at the first few words in verse 41. After Jesus stills the storm and everything is calm. How are they feeling about this moment? They were terrified. And they asked each other, "Who is this that the wind and waves obey?" They had called him teacher, don't you care if we drown? And he had stilled the storm. Who's in the house? Or rather, on the boat? The one who controls creation. No wonder they were terrified. No one can stand before God, the Bible says. No one can appear in his presence. No one can be with him. No one can even look on him and continue to exist. And Jesus is in the boat with them. It's exactly the right response. And notice, these ancient people aren't kind of going God of the gaps. We don't know how to explain lightning, therefore there is a God of lightning. No, these ancient people, the Jews, they go, we know that human beings don't control creation. God reveals himself as the one who made all of creation and controls all of creation. And the guy standing in the boat just did that. He must be the stiller of storms, the Lord of creation. How great is Jesus' power for your protection? How much of life can Jesus control on your behalf? All of it. Here's the stiller of storms. All of creation, all of the cosmos, all people are ultimately under his control. That's how great his power is. But the second point, it's amazing, is that Jesus shows his power is for us. That it's going to be used on our behalf. That Jesus uses his power for those who are perishing, to protect those who are perishing. Verse 38, Jesus is in the stern, sleep on a cushion. The disciples wake him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? You can see their question. It's an accusation really, isn't it? Jesus is asleep. He doesn't care about what's happening. Isn't this our accusation to God when things go wrong? God, why would you let this happen? If you're powerful, why were you asleep at the wheel? Why don't you wake up and do something and fix this problem? God, don't you care that the pandemic is killing hundreds of thousands of people? Don't you care, God, that death is ripping families apart? Mothers and brothers and sisters and daughters and grandparents and children. But look at Jesus' words. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" See, they are afraid because I think two things. They don't trust Jesus. They don't trust his love for them and his power to protect them. Can you see those two things? Don't you care if we are perishing? Maybe they sense his power for them, but they're not confident that he loves them because they're like, question is, don't you care that we are perishing? And Jesus challenges them. Do you still have no faith? What he's saying is, do you still not trust me? Do you still not trust me that I care for you? After all you've seen me do for people, don't you trust me that I care for you and that I will protect you? It's a little bit like this. My brother Nathan, he's 4 years younger than me, and occasionally we would double each other on the motorbike to get things done around the farm. And he was a little bit more confident and a little bit more ambitious on the motorbike. And he would love to go fast. He would absolutely love to go fast. And we would race through the stock route over dam banks, under branches, weaving through thistles. But sometimes I'd yell out, "Slow down!" And Nathan would yell out, "Don't you trust me? Don't you trust my skills on this behemoth of a bike?" Actually, little brother, no, I don't. No, I don't, especially when you're doubling me. No, I don't. Mind you, I think, at least as far as I know, he had less accidents than me, or he was better at hiding them when he did have them. Anyway, we'll just put that to the side. But see, you can see if I trusted him, his ability, his power, his skill, and his protection of me, I wouldn't yell out, "Slow down." But exactly because I'm questioning his skills, his strength, his power, his love, saying, "Whoa, Nathan, you don't have this." Jesus challenged his disciples. You don't trust me that I care for you. You don't believe, perhaps, that I have the power to protect you. Where are you at? Isn't the disciples' question our question when a plane full of children crashes? Or perhaps a friend commits suicide? Or when a pandemic rages? God, don't you care that we are perishing? See, what makes you afraid? Have you been afraid of losing your job this year? Afraid of COVID? Afraid of the craziness in America and what that might mean for the rest of the world? Afraid for the craziness in other parts of the world and what that might mean for Australia. Afraid of the future, what the future might hold for you. Afraid for your children. Afraid for your A-boards. But see, what we're ultimately afraid of is that God doesn't care for us. That God doesn't have the power to protect us. That if bad things happen, that they will be inevitably and terribly bad, and that God is at work in those things for our good. That we don't have God's love, care and protection. But this passage shows us we don't need to be afraid if we follow Jesus. We have no reason to be afraid of anything in life or of sickness nor death, nor anything in the spiritual realm, nor anything in the physical realm. See, the logic is this. Our world is filled with storms, chaos, disasters, difficulty, pandemics. Why? Because sin is in the world and sin is in our hearts. We rejected God, and God tilted the world off balance so that we would realize we can't live without God. And that's why the world is filled with storms. But that's the first part of the logic. But the second part is that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. He is in fact not just the Messiah, but God the Son, who is God on earth with all of God's power and authority. That's the second thing. And the third thing is that Jesus faced that ultimate storm for us. That Jesus went to the cross to face sin and God's judgment at sin, and to face death itself on behalf of all humanity. That Jesus faced that ultimate storm of death and judgment. That's what the cross is all about. Why? To deal with sin in the world and in our hearts, to conquer it, to bring a new world to come. That's Jesus' ultimate plan when he returns. But Jesus hushed the storm of death and judgment by facing God's wrath and anger at sin on himself. On the cross, he said to sin and judgment, shh, by paying for it himself, so that he could protect everyone else from sin and judgment. That's how much God cares for the perishing. He faced death and judgment himself to protect us from death and judgment. It's the cross that shows that God cares for us, the perishing. Romans 5:8. For God demonstrates his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It's hard to hold that truth in our hearts when life is out of control or chaotic. But it's the great truth we need to lean into, that God cares for us more than we know. And God cared for us despite our rejection of him. God shows his love for us while we were still sinners. And God won't let us go. Even if we do face illness or sickness or unemployment, God won't let those things conquer us. God won't let those things separate us from his love for us in Jesus. And God won't let death itself or judgment stop us from living. We may die, but we will not perish. We'll come through death to live with God forever if we've trusted Jesus, who faced the storm for us. God cares for the perishing. Let me open up for questions or comments or reflections. Hey, Xavier, do you want to turn that recording off now? That's right. Thanks, mate. Questions, comments, reflections?